Following the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, much of Asia Minor was in disarray. The Seljuk Turks and their Anatolian derivative, the Sultanate of Rum, had dominated the region for 2 centuries, but with the arrival of the Mongols, they had fragmented into numerous warring microstates called Beyliks. Adjacent to them, on modern Turkey's western shore, were the remaining cities still held by the Byzantine Empire, itself fragmented and crumbling ever since its sacking by Christian armies during the Fourth Crusade. This sole remaining continuous descendant of the Roman Empire had become subject to Frankish, Venetian and Genoese control, who carved up the once mighty empire among themselves, leaving only a handful of disconnected regions under autonomous Greek sovereignty, which lacked the resources and manpower to adequately protect its outlying possessions. On this porous Anatolian frontier bordering the Byzantines, a small clan, led by a warlord by the name of Osman, managed to expand at the expense of both Greek and Turkic neighbours. The Osman, or its more familiar English derivative, Ottoman dynasty, being located in the far west of Anatolia, had managed to stay under the radar of the Mongols and their successor states. As a result, the Ottoman homelands were largely unmolested, and they could invest in building up their own political, military and social agenda, expanding both into vulnerable Byzantine borderlands as well as the Mongol-ravaged heartlands. By the 1360s, the state had become significant enough compared to its neighbours to style itself as a sultanate. But its army initially consisted largely of mounted warriors, conducting hit-and-run raids rather than pitched battles. It lacked a cohesive infantry and had no siege weapons. But by the 1380s, they had already acquired artillery and had formed the first modern standing army and perhaps the first infantry force in the world to be equipped with firearms: the Janissaries. The Yanichari, or Janissaries, were the most famous of the Ottoman elite military corps, famous for their internal cohesion, fanaticism, and strict discipline. Their recruitment was based on the devshirme system of forced child levy enslavement, by which indigenous European Christian boys from the Balkans, predominantly Albanians, Bulgarians, Croats, Greeks, Romanians, Serbs, and Ukrainians, were forcibly taken from their families, subject to circumcision, forced conversion to Islam, and then admitted into an austere and harsh military academy. Unlike typical slaves, Janissaries belonged to the Sultan personally. Despite their origins and circumstances, they were, compared to the rest of the population, highly educated, and were even paid regular salaries. Forbidden to grow beards or to marry before the age of 40, their complete loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan was expected. Through a system of meritocracy and loyalty, ferocity in battle and devotion to Islam, Janissaries eventually became members of a new military class that, in time, came to wield enormous power and social prestige. After 25 years of service, the average Janissary was allowed to retire and received land grants and a pension for life. This status as the Sultan's men made them all but immune to civil or judicial authorities and granted them many other social privileges when they eventually entered civilian life. So it was that a young Albanian Janissary cavalry officer by the name of Yakub was about to embark on a campaign that would change the course of history. As the Ottoman Sultanate continued to go from strength to strength, the Byzantine Greeks, who had finally wrested control of Constantinople from the Franks, were nevertheless unable to consolidate their former territories. Much of the south was still in the hands of French nobles. Many Aegean islands were still firmly in Venetian and Genoese hands, while to the west and north, Slavs had taken huge chunks of formerly Byzantine territory. Constantinople had endured several outbreaks of the bubonic plague. Numerous palace coups and even a series of major earthquakes, which devastated the Gallipoli Peninsula, such that the Ottomans easily swarmed in and conquered what was left of its crumbling cities. Having crossed the Dardanelles and established a foothold on the Greek mainland, within a couple of decades it was the Ottomans, and not the Byzantines, who had pushed back the Serbs and Bulgarians, annexing those territories for themselves. It wasn't long before they turned their attention back to Constantinople, a small, though highly fortified triangular peninsula at the mouth of the Bosporus Strait. By 1390, they had been completely enveloped and were paying tribute to the Sultan to avoid outright war. But by the beginning of the 15th century, when the Sultan began meddling in its internal politics, Orthodox Greek Byzantium eventually felt compelled to do the unthinkable, and reached out to Catholic Europe for aid, even committing itself to accept the authority of the Pope if they were to come to its rescue. But England and France were still deeply mired in the 100 Years' War. Spain was busy with its Reconquista, the Poles were busy hammering the Teutonic Order, the Germans were getting thrashed by the Hussites, and the Hungarians had already copped a drubbing by the Ottomans at Varna. The only ones who could realistically help were the Venetians and the Genoese, who despised each other as much as they did the Greeks. But cognizant of the threat the Ottomans now posed to their island possessions in the Aegean, they quickly sent their navies to relieve Constantinople and harass coastal Ottoman cities in Anatolia. Venetian and Genoese aggression was all the pretext Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II needed, and he swiftly laid siege to Constantinople. The Christians put up a valiant defence, and for a time Ottoman resolve seemed to falter, as wave after wave of assaults were repulsed, despite their enormous guns and relentless bombardment of the ancient walls. But the Sultan's promise of limitless plunder, and with numerical superiority of 10-1, elite Janissaries finally breached the walls in May of 1453. And the city once again fell victim to bloodthirsty hordes of marauders, this time Muslim, who now also looted and pillaged the city for days on end. The Ottomans would soon go on to wrest control of the rest of the Greek mainland, as well as the Black Sea coast from Latin and Byzantine control, causing an enormous exodus of refugees who fled on Venetian and Genoese ships. Their arrival in Italy brought an influx of Greco-Roman science and culture that was a crucial factor in kickstarting the European Renaissance. The Ottomans, for their part, now quickly made Constantinople their own capital and set about restoring it to its former glory as a cultural and economic centre, much to the ire, it has to be said, of other Islamic states, who now also viewed Sultan Mehmed II as a potential threat. For all their military prowess on land, the real Achilles' heel of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century was its lack of anything even remotely resembling a navy. This became apparent in its attempt to secure the Aegean Islands, now that it had wrested control of the Greek and Latin-held mainland. The Venetians and Genoese were well entrenched, and their mastery of the seas provided a real obstacle to the ambitions of the Ottoman Sultan. An example was the island of Lesbos, lying right next to its own heartland, but which was only conquered by the Ottomans a full decade after the fall of Constantinople, and then remained the subject of continual attacks by the Venetians for the next several decades. Indeed, the Aegean now became a veritable hornet's nest of raids and piracy, with the aforementioned Genoese and Venetians being joined by Catalan, Sicilian, Greek, and even Muslim adventurers, keen on plundering the Sultan's treasure ships and burgeoning new maritime trade networks. But if the Ottomans were deficient in maritime technology, they eventually acquired instruction in the Neptunian arts by the Christian inhabitants that remained on the islands after conquest, as well as by those Janissaries and other Muslim settlers that quickly colonized freshly annexed regions, and who themselves adopted the islander lifestyle,